Hello, I'm Carlton Van Putten, founder and CEO of PayRent. Welcome to the Keys to Success podcast, where we unlock the secrets to smarter investments, smoother tenant management, and bigger profits, one episode at a time. Ready to master your property game? Let's dive in.
Welcome back to Keys to Success. Unlock your property potential. Are rising costs kind of squeezing your rental income?
Yeah, it's something a lot of landlords are feeling.
You're definitely in the right place then.
Yeah.
Today, we're zeroing in on why, your expenses for pretty much everything from renovations to new appliances might be climbing.
Mm-hmm.
And more importantly, what you as a landlord can actually maybe do about it.
Exactly. And what's really interesting, I think, is how these global trade decisions are directly hitting your bottom line as a property owner.
Right.
We're really focusing today on the 2025 tariffs the United States has put in place on, well, all sorts of imported goods.
Okay.
And these aren't just, abstract economic things. They have real consequences for the cost of materials you need for your properties.
Yeah, this stuff we actually buy.
Exactly. We've looked at recent reports, some expert analysis from 2023 right through to 2025 to really try and bring you a clear picture of what's going on.
Okay, so let's dive into these tariffs then. Simply put, they're taxes,
Yeah.
right, on goods coming into the country.
That's the gist of it, yeah. When goods arrive, a fee gets added.
That cost, it usually ends up with us, the buyer, meaning higher prices.
Almost always, yeah. And for landlords, this is hitting some really, really key areas.
Like what?
Well, think about steel. There's a 25% tariff that's actually been around since 2018.
Okay, still going?
Still going. Then aluminum tariffs between 10 and 25%, also continuing. But here's a big one, especially if you're planning property improvements, softwood lumber.
Oh, lumber.
Tariffs on Canadian lumber, they're climbing, expected to hit a pretty significant 34.5% in 2025.
Wow, 34.5%. That's up from what, around 14, 15?
Yeah, around 14.5%. So it's a big jump.
Okay. And connecting this back to, our everyday reality as landlords.
Yeah.
Where do these materials actually get used?
Well, steel, that's crucial for, say, structural repairs, sometimes roofing components. And the U.S. imports a fair bit of steel, about 17%.
So that tariff hits broad then?
It does. Drives up costs for just essential maintenance. Same idea with aluminum. The U.S. imports roughly 80% of its aluminum.
80%. Okay.
Yeah, so that affects things like siding repairs, window frames, gutters, all that stuff.
Right. And the lumber.
Yeah,
You said about a third of what we use comes from Canada.
roughly, yeah. About a third.
So those rising tariffs, they just directly mean higher costs for framing walls in a new unit or replacing damaged flooring, maybe building a deck.
Any renovation project involving wood, basically, it
Yeah.
could easily add thousands to the cost of just one project, just the lumber alone.
Wow. Okay, but it's not just the raw materials, is it? Like the 2x4s and steel beams.
No, that's a really important point. What about the finished products, the things you actually put into your rental unit?
Yeah, like appliances.
Exactly. So in early 2025, tariffs on imports from China went up to roughly 20%. And that it's a whole range of home electronics and appliances.
Okay, so refrigerators, ovens,
Mm-hmm.
HVAC systems.
All of those. Plus electrical components, light fixtures, wiring, a lot of that stuff is made overseas.
And a 20% tariff? That adds a pretty hefty chunk to the price tag.
It really does. Some experts are estimating the cost of just typical household fixtures could go up maybe 10%, maybe even 20% under these new tariffs.
Ouch. So replacing a broken fridge in a rental,
Yeah.
suddenly a bigger expense.
Yep.
Upgrading an old AC unit takes a bigger slice of the budget.
Absolutely.
Even those smaller updates, like swapping out old light fixtures property-wide, that's going to add up faster now.
Mm-hmm. And, beyond these kind of big ticket items, there's also a general baseline tariff on lots of other imported goods, right?
Yeah, I think I read about that. Like a 10% baseline.
That's right. A 10% tariff on most other imported goods. And that can touch things you might not think about right away, like cement for foundation work,
Cement.
copper wiring for electrical jobs, even glass for windows. Yeah, I mean, the U.S. imports about a quarter of its cement, mostly from Canada and Mexico. So tariffs there will push up the cost of any concrete work.
So even though some partners like Canada and Mexico have the USMCA trade deal,
Right. which exempts some things.
The overall trend is still costs going up for lots of imported building stuff.
That's the clear picture, yeah.
Yeah.
These tariffs are definitely contributing to rising costs across a pretty wide range.
Okay, so we see how the tariffs make the materials more expensive. But how does this sort of ripple out? How does it affect our businesses as landlords in a bigger way? What's the larger impact?
Well, the most immediate thing is just straight up higher construction and renovation costs. And remember, these tariffs are landing when material prices were already high.
Yeah, from all the supply chain rest before.
Exactly. The National Association of Home Builders, they reported that overall residential construction material costs jumped. Get this, 34% between late 2020 and early 2025.
34%.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, huge. And tariffs have definitely played a role in that increase. Industry estimates are saying the recent tariff changes alone are adding somewhere around $9,000 to $11,000 to the cost of building an average new single-family home.
$9,000 to $11,000 extra.
Yeah.
Just from tariffs.
As of early 2025, yeah. And some projections are even scarier. They suggest it could climb to maybe $17,000, even $22,000 per new home if all the announced tariffs actually stick.
Man, that's a massive increase. And for us as landlords, whether we're thinking about building new rentals, expanding the portfolio,
Right.
or even just doing necessary upgrades on existing units to keep good tenants,
Yeah,
these higher material costs just slam our profitability, don't they?
they really do. A project that maybe looked pretty good on paper a year ago might now seem much less attractive or maybe even impossible financially.
Yeah.
And these increased costs, they can also ripple out into property values and rent levels.
So,
Well, higher costs to build and renovate, that naturally puts upward pressure on home prices generally, and also on what landlords feel they need to charge for rent,
right.
which, then bumps up against tenant affordability. And potentially that could even soften demand and affect the value of your investment if costs get too high for people.
So we might feel like we have to raise rents to cover these higher maintenance costs, pricier appliances, repair parts.
Right, the pressure.
But then we have to worry if our tenants can actually afford those increases and what that does to our vacancy rates. It's a tricky balance.
It really is. And there's another angle too. The higher costs can lead to less new construction overall.
Okay. Because it's just too expensive for developers.
Exactly. If building new rental units becomes too pricey, developers might just pause or even cancel projects altogether.
Which could make the housing shortage worse in many places.
It could, yeah. Now, short term, that might keep rents high for your existing properties because supply is tight.
Right, less competition.
But long term, it limits your own opportunities to grow your rental business by acquiring new builds down the line.
This sounds like it just injects a lot of instability into everything. Are these tariffs also messing with, project timelines? How long things take?
Oh, absolutely. The sheer unpredictability of tariffs makes planning and sticking to schedules really, really hard for renovations or new builds.
Because the rules could change midway through.
Precisely. Tariffs can shift relatively quickly depending on trade talks, policy changes. It adds this huge layer of uncertainty that construction, which often involves long timelines, really struggles with.
Yeah, you need predictability for big projects.
You do. So we're seeing builders being much more cautious now when they bid on jobs or schedule new projects, just because of the risk of sudden cost spikes.
So that renovation we budgeted for 6 months ago could suddenly cost way more if a key material tariff changes while the work's happening.
That's exactly the risk. It makes managing your finances and keeping projects on track incredibly challenging.
Yeah, no kidding.
And this uncertainty can also just stretch out the actual construction timelines. If materials suddenly get way more expensive, or maybe even harder to get hold of because of tariffs.
Projects get delayed.
Yeah, projects get delayed while builders scramble for alternatives, or maybe just wait for prices to hopefully settle down. There were even reports back in early 2025 of some builders trying to stockpile materials.
Buying up stuff in advance.
Yeah, trying to lock in prices, which, might help their specific project, but it ties up their cash.
And could create shortages for others.
Exactly. And remember that temporary 90-day pause on some tariffs that started in April 2025?
Oh, yeah. Heard about that.
Well, that gave a little breathing room, but the big question is, what happens when that pause ends? It just adds to the ongoing uncertainty in the market.
Okay, wow. This definitely paints a clear, if slightly stressful, picture of the challenges. But, landlords, we tend to be pretty resourceful. What practical advice can you offer? How can we navigate these tariff headwinds and try to protect our profitability?
Okay, yeah, let's talk solutions. There are definitely proactive steps you can take. One important strategy is to really explore your options for sourcing materials. Get creative.
Like looking beyond the usual suppliers.
Maybe. Or, if it's feasible where you are, investigate local suppliers more, especially for things like lumber.
Ah, okay. Like if you're near forests.
Exactly. For instance, the Pacific Northwest or the Southeast, they have more developed domestic lumber industries. Sourcing from them might offer some protection from those Canadian lumber tariffs.
Interesting.
And, beyond just price, sometimes local sourcing means stronger relationships, maybe faster delivery. But of course, you have to weigh that against maybe less selection or smaller scale than the big national guys.
Right, trade-offs.
Yeah.
But supporting local could potentially mean more stable pricing long-term, too.
Oh.
Makes sense. What else should we think about?
Another key approach is something called value engineering.
Value engineering, what's that?
It basically means taking a really close look at your renovation plans or your designs for new construction and seeing if you can swap in alternative materials, ones that are maybe less affected by tariffs.
But without cheaping out, right? Still needs to be good quality.
Absolutely.
But
Without sacrificing the quality or the appeal that your tenants expect. So, for example, maybe you look at different types of durable flooring instead of traditional hardwood if hardwood tariffs are high.
Okay.
Or maybe you optimize building designs to use more standard size components, which could cut down on material waste and costs.
So being smart with substitutions, finding efficiencies without compromising the end product. Got it. What about the money side? Our planning.
Yeah, long-term financial planning and just really careful budgeting are, well, more critical than ever now.
Definitely.
You absolutely need to incorporate potential tariff-related cost increases into your forecasts, both for just ongoing property maintenance and any future development plans.
Could build it into the projections.
And build in a contingency fund, too. Having that buffer to cover unpredictable cost jumps is just, well, it's wise.
Okay. So when we're projecting costs for, say, replacing roofs in 5 years or setting our rent goals, we need to actively factor in these potential tariff bumps.
Absolutely. And another tool, especially if you're doing significant renovations or building new,
Yeah.
consider including price escalation clauses in your contracts with contractors.
Price escalation clauses, how do those work?
They basically provide a way to adjust the contract price if material costs shoot up beyond a certain point because of unforeseen things like tariff changes.
Ah, so it offers some protection against sudden spikes.
For both you and the contractor, ideally. But you need to be really clear when you set them up. Define what triggers an escalation, how the price adjustment gets calculated, make it fair for everyone involved.
That seems like a smart way to manage some of that cost uncertainty. Mentioned sourcing earlier. It seems like where we get materials is even more critical now.
It really is. Supplier diversification is another valuable tactic here.
Meaning, don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. Explore different suppliers. Look domestically, look internationally, keeping tariffs in mind, obviously. But try to reduce your dependence on just one source, especially for critical materials.
Right. If your main supplier gets hit hard by a tariff.
You need options. Having multiple suppliers gives you more flexibility, maybe even a bit more negotiating leverage, even with tariffs in the mix.
Makes sense. Any other tactics for landlords?
Well, bulk purchasing is something to think about, but you need to be cautious.
Buying big quantities when prices seem okay.
Yeah, if you have the cash flow. And importantly, the storage space. Buying certain non-perishable materials in bulk when prices look favorable could save you money, but you're tying up capital up front. And there's always the risk that market prices could actually drop after you buy. So it's a calculation.
Okay. So maybe if we know we've got like 3 identical kitchen renos coming up and we see a deal on cabinets,
Yeah.
maybe worth considering, but weigh the risks.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned earlier, and it's important that the impact of these tariffs isn't going to be exactly the same everywhere, right?
Right. The regional differences.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that for landlords listening in different areas?
Sure. The effect really can vary depending on where your properties are. Regions that have historically relied more heavily on specific imported materials. Think about the Northeast using a lot of Canadian lumber.
Yeah.
They might feel the pinch from those specific lumber tariffs more acutely than, say, an area with a stronger local lumber supply.
Okay.
And the type of construction that's common in a region also matters. Steel tariffs, for instance, they'll likely hit harder in big cities with lots of high-rise apartments using steel frames.
compared to suburban areas with mostly wood frame houses.
Exactly. Compared to more suburban or rural areas where single-family wood frame construction is the norm.
So a landlord doing lots of renos in, say, New England might really feel those lumber tariffs.
Potentially, yeah.
While someone managing older steel frame apartment buildings in a city might see a bigger hit from rising steel costs.
That's the kind of variation we're talking about. And one more thing. The strength of your local rental market plays a big role, too.
In terms of passing costs on.
Yeah, exactly. How much of these increased costs you might realistically be able to pass on to tenants through rent increases. In really hot markets with strong demand, low vacancy, maybe some parts of the Sun Belt,
You might have more leeway.
you might be able to offset some of the higher expenses with rent adjustments, but in more competitive markets or price-sensitive areas,
Trying to hike rents too much could backfire.
could lead to longer vacancies, make your properties less competitive. You really, really need to understand the dynamics of your specific local market.
So what works in Austin might not fly in Cleveland. We need to tailor our approach based on where we are.
Absolutely. Tailor it to your local circumstances, ultimately. Look, these 2025 tariffs, they definitely create real financial hurdles for landlords. There's no denying it.
Yeah.
But by understanding how they specifically impact your business and by proactively adapting your strategies, exploring different sourcing, considering material swaps, careful long-term financial planning,
You can navigate it better.
you can better navigate this evolving economic landscape and really work to maintain the profitability of your rental properties.
Okay. So thinking ahead, what other creative solutions could landlords maybe come up with to lessen the blow of these rising costs and, keep their rental businesses thriving in this environment? It's definitely something for all of us to mull over.
Absolutely.
Well, if you found this discussion valuable today and you want more insights into navigating the sometimes complex world of property ownership, please be sure to like and subscribe. And for a much more detailed breakdown of these specific tariffs we talked about and their potential effects, definitely visit www.payrent.com. That's payrent.com for the full article details.
Lots more info there.
Thank you so much for joining us on Keys to Success. Unlock your property potential. We'll catch you next time with more strategies to help you thrive.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Keys to Success. I invite you to check out past episodes and follow us on your favorite podcast platform to get notified when new ones are released. And when you're ready to simplify managing your properties, be sure to visit us at www.payrent.com.